Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock. The SNP has held emergency talks as police investigating its finances question Treasurer Colin Beattie. His arrests overshadowed a major address to Parliament by new First Minister Humza Yousaf. Gina Davidson is LBC's Scotland political editor and has more details about the 71-year-old.
Colin Beattie, who is a backbench SNP, he's been that since 2011. He's not somebody many people, bar his constituents, will have heard of before, and SNP members, of course, because he has also been the treasurer of the party for a long period, from 2004 to 2020.
At least 4 people have been stabbed and seriously injured at a gym in the western German city of Duisburg. The attack or attackers are on the run. Police are warning people to avoid the area. A man charged over the shooting of a black teenager in Kansas has handed himself in to police. Ralph Jarl is in hospital after he was shot when he rang the wrong doorbell. And energy suppliers have agreed to ban the forced installation of prepayment meters for customers who are over 85 or seriously ill. But charities say the measures, drawn up after contractors were filmed breaking into houses, don't go far enough. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 29 points at 79.09. The pound buys $1.24 and €1.13. LBC weather. Much of the UK will be largely clear tonight and turn chilly. The odd shower in the far southwest, a low of freezing. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 8:01 here on LBC. Welcome to Tuesday's Cross Question. Now, let me introduce the panel to you. To my left, Thangam Debbonaire, Labour's shadow leader of the House of Commons and MP for Bristol West. Kit Malthouse, to her left, is Conservative MP for North West Hampshire and former Education Secretary. Iain Dunt, on my far right, is political commentator who's also the author of the new book, How Westminster Works, ... And those 3 dots are quite important in that title, and why it doesn't is the next bit. And Sophia Gaston is Head of Foreign Policy and UK Resilience for the Policy Exchange think tank. They're here to answer your questions. The way you ask a question is to phone 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850, or you can say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And of course, you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
And Stuart starts the hour off well by saying, I hope West Ham get relegated. Thank you, Stuart. Let's go to our first caller. It's Brenda in St Ives in Cambridgeshire. Hello, Brenda.
Hello, Iain. Good evening, panel. My question is, what priority does the panel put on the welfare of our children, having heard this afternoon from Professor Michael Marmot that some supermarkets are hiding baby milk because parents are stealing it? Last week it was all about teachers not being able to do what they to teach properly, putting their own resources into their subjects to teach the children. You know, the children are our next generation. The next, we've got to really seriously think about this. We've got 250,000 children waiting for mental health appointments. We've got 800,000 on the poverty line. This is a serious problem because we will not have a generation when I leave this earth at 84 now. I'm really, really concerned about it.
The great thing is, Brenda, you don't sound 84. That's the main thing. Kit Malthouse, former Education Secretary. I mean, I have to say, I hadn't heard this before, but Michael Marmot was saying this on Andrew Marr's show earlier on this evening, saying that supermarkets are literally hiding baby milk in case it's stolen. I mean, what kind of society do we live in when that can happen?
Yeah, I'd be asking some serious questions if I was the boss of that supermarket about what the people on the ground are actually doing, and let's hope it's not an order from the centre, because that sounds like a monstrous thing to do. I mean, the question was, what priority do you give it? And I guess you have to give it, well, certainly I would give it the same priority that I give to my own family, which is that the kids always come first. And certainly I have to say it was a theme. It was one of the things that brought me into Parliament actually in 2015 was children and childhood. And I was about, just before I became a minister, about to launch a campaign called One Chance at Childhood, because we sometimes forget that actually it's very quick right? They're through it fast. The impact on them of things that happen or don't happen to them during those years can be profound and cause enormous problems into the future if we're not careful for them and for society as a whole. And so I would be very pro a huge concentration on children and childhood, and I've told the Prime Minister that in terms.
What about the National Education Union today? They are saying that they're trying to persuade Labour to include a pledge at the next election in their manifesto for free school meals for all pupils. The Guardian article that wrote this up in the way that only the Guardian can didn't actually mention what it would cost. But I wonder whether you think that's something that all political parties ought to be looking at now.
I don't know. I mean, we've never had universal free school meals in the UK throughout all ages. Some schools do it. I know some boroughs, I think Islington now, are giving free school meals to all kids. However, we have had targeted free school meals, obviously, for those who need it. And generally, my view is if you're spending the taxpayers' money, it should be targeted on those people who need it. I would rather give a better meal to kids who need it and not a free meal to Richard Branson's kids if they go to state school. So I'd prefer targeting, but the key thing is, well, I don't know, he might have sent his kids to stage, or he might not. I was just plucking a rich person out of the air. But I think the key thing is that we have to think about the whole environment around children and parents, and how we can both support parents and kids through that process, because fundamentally in society we actually need, we have got a demographic problem. We need to encourage people to have children. We need them to know that when they do have children, they're going to be supported and helped. That's why I was so pleased to see the childcare stuff that I worked on when I was Secretary of State for Education appear in the budget, and that there is an atmosphere where people feel able to bring children into the world and know that they'll get the support they need through the whole process. So to me, it's fundamental, not just from a kind of moral and societal point of view, but also, frankly, from an economic point of view.
Iain Dunt.
Yeah, I mean, that's a bleak story. I hadn't heard it until now, and it's kind of indicative of something going severely wrong. It's almost like we've sort of tired of the cost of living story, because it just keeps on drumming on again and again. So instead we have a conversation about the boats or about knives or about maths. But nevertheless, in the country, it just keeps on permeating and impacting, and you see parents having to make those kinds of decisions. So that's what you're looking at, is the business end of what a cost of living crisis looks like.
Interesting text here from Richard in Hertford, who says supermarkets have been putting security tags on child formula milk since my son was a baby, and he's 18 now. It costs as much as a bottle of scotch and is a regularly targeted item by thieves. Well, you learn something new every day, don't you, Sophia?
Well, I have heard about this story, and I have to say I've been doing a lot of focus groups over the last few months, and, pretty harrowing stories of personal experience coming through in those. I mean, it's loud and clear. We are in an extremely difficult economic environment. I think everybody across all classes is feeling it to some extent, but obviously those who were already struggling are really noticing. I think sometimes in Westminster we don't think about the fact that, there are people for whom the increase in the cost of a stick of butter going up from, £1.20 to £1.40 is a big deal for them. And people who are shopping for their pensioner parents, and struggling to get them everything they need. So I think this is a terrible story, but frankly, I'm not surprised by it. I mean, I think if you go out and talk to people around the country, these are the sorts of stories you're hearing all the time. I mean, the fact is that children, unfortunately, are going to be touched by a situation which is affecting the country as a whole. I think when you start to think about, the impacts on children that from the pandemic and the sort of cumulative stress that a lot of them have been under, I think, it is right to look at children as a specific group here and think about what kind of support that we should be giving for them in an extraordinary time.
Okay, Thangam, Debbonaire.
Well, I think, one of the things you can judge the Labour Party on is our record, and the last Labour government had the phrase "every child matters" at the heart of all of our policy making. It influenced, I can't think of anything that we did that didn't have "every child matters" running through it. It was, I think, a really influential slogan. It helped people to focus us. And if every child matters, that means not just saying that you want children to be at the heart of your policy making kit, it means actually doing it. We are in a cost of living crisis which has many causes. causes, but some of them are because of decisions taken by the former Prime Minister Liz Truss and her Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng, and the current Prime Minister cheering that on now. There are a whole set of
the current Prime Minister, with respect,
there
is
are
not
cheering it on. Far from
well,
it.
he's
He is Prime Minister because he didn't cheer it on.
And he is part of that, as are the entire government party. And I think the whole point of what I do as an MP is because I want the next generation to live a better life from ours. That's just normal for most families, most parents, most adults want the next generation to do better. It's why most of us come into politics of whatever party. It's why we've made a priority in the Labour Party to invest in breakfast clubs so that children can start the day with a decent hot meal. It's why we know that investing in our schools and our teachers is so important. And it's why we know that the cost of living crisis, as Sophia said, it's what's coming up on the doorstep across the country. And it's people who actually quite often will have jobs that have hitherto managed to cover their necessary expenses and more. And now they're finding it's barely covering the basics. Food inflation is rocketing, and it's going up in particular for the sorts of food that people on low incomes depend on. It's going up particularly hard, and that's making life incredibly difficult. But I really think that this story of that happening in supermarkets just shows what a state we're in for one of the wealthiest
according
countries.
to our text, though, it's been happening for years. It's not anything new.
Well, I mean, it was news to me when I heard it today.
To be fair.
So,
what about this idea of free school meals that the National Education Union are trying to persuade the Labour Party to adopt? Now, I know you can't sit here and say, oh, yes, that's a good idea, we'll adopt it in our manifesto because Rachel Reeves would have your guts for garters.
Well,
but, I mean, in principle, I mean, if the money was there, do you think it would be a good idea to have its universal free school meals? Or do you think, as Kit said, that maybe the best way to spend the money is to target it on those families that really can't afford them?
well, I mean, the thing about politics is about choices. It's not our money, it's the taxpayers' money, and they don't have a lot of it right now, and they're trying their hardest to make it stretch, and we have a duty as political parties, when in government, to treat that money with respect, because it's not ours. And so it's a big if to say if the money was there. I mean, I think you said the story in The Guardian, I couldn't see a figure either for how much it would actually cost, and I'm certainly,
I'm glad you were
said,
looking for it.
not going to commit to a policy.
But the Welsh Government have done this, haven't they?
And that's part of the point of devolution, isn't it, Iain, is that you decide that certain decisions you are going to devolve, as we all agreed to do with the devolution legislation of the last Labour government, that the Welsh Government could make a set of decisions, the Scottish Government makes decisions, local councils make decisions. I think it's very helpful that we can learn from what different parts of the country are doing, and I think, as Kit mentioned, certain local authorities are doing it. Mm-hmm. We need to learn what works and what doesn't. There will be choices to be made after the next general election about how we spend what I'm afraid to say looks like scant resources. And if we've got an economy that is growing as slowly as the one is at the moment, we are going to have to be incredibly careful. There will be plenty of demands on that money, like getting the NHS restored to a place where where people feel proud and able to do the jobs that they went in the NHS to work for. That is in itself going to cost us money. So we need to be able to cost every single thing we do, and I'm certainly not going to commit to something without knowing.
Oh, so the answer is maybe not.
No, the answer is I want to learn what for instance, those local authorities that are doing it in the Welsh Government, we know how that's working out, but we will have priorities to make, just as the current government does. We'll have difficult decisions.
To govern is to choose.
Yes, it is.
We'll come to more of your calls in just a moment on Cross Question. It's 13 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
16 minutes past 8. Anthony says, Iain, you've no idea how people are struggling with food inflation. I do, actually, because I hear it every day on the programme. You criticise The Guardian for not providing a figure on the cost of free school meals. Who cares what the cost is? There speaks a Guardian reader. You look well nourished, thank you very much. Imagine getting up hungry and going to bed hungry. Guess you can't. As usual, Cross Question is the usual puff piece about you. Well, that's nice, isn't it? Actually, I can imagine what it's like getting up hungry, because it has happened to me in the past, contrary to what you might think. But there we go. Let's move on to another call. David is in Uxbridge. David, hello. What's your question, please?
Yeah, hi, Ian. Thanks for taking my call. I'd like to ask the panel about James Cleverly's comments about China this evening, about not pulling down the shutters. And what's their position? Do you think we should follow the US in a more hawkish Cold War relationship, or should we be more like Macron and pragmatic, given China is the second largest economy and becoming a technological powerhouse? What should Britain's relationship with China be, given all the factors and the pull factors towards the US, or the more European position?
That's such a good question. James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, he's currently in Japan for a meeting of the G7 foreign ministers, and he said that Britain should not pull the shutters down on China, as it would be counterproductive to the national interest, which kind of reflects what President Macron, as you say, has also been saying. He's been in China recently. Sophia, Gaston, let's come to you. You're the foreign policy expert on the panel.
Well, I think we often discuss sort of different countries' approaches to China as if there's a kind of hierarchy of hawkishness and dovishness. The reality is that, like the UK, all of our allies is in some ways seeking to balance openness and security. And of course, everyone does have slightly different relationships with China, and how their sort of economic entanglement is structured, different types of vulnerabilities. We have all been going through a process, which I fully support, of becoming much more conscious of the security dimensions of our relationship with China and putting a lot of important things in place to protect ourselves. We have to only be able to engage from a position of confidence, and if we don't have those measures in place, then we simply cannot do that. I think the United States actually is not following a path that is too dissimilar to some of our allies that we might think of are a bit more on the hawkishness spectrum, like Australia, but also it's not that dissimilar to what we're doing here as well. I think really the trend over recent months has been towards trying to take the temperature down in terms of public rhetoric. Everyone's looking for a stabilization of relations. But behind the scenes, I think work is continuing apace as it is in the United States to actually make sure that we've got all the policy and legislative instruments there to actually make sure that we're securing ourselves. At the end of the day, a lot of, America's sort of hawkishness and that have felt like under Trump, a lot of that was language. What we really need to be making sure is that we're doing the work behind the scenes on the systems level stuff so that we're actually properly protected, because that's at the end of the day what's really going to matter.
OK. Thangam, Debbonaire.
Well, I mean, I don't like the concept of bringing shutters down on any country unless you absolutely have to. I mean, we are obviously in a very complicated situation at the moment in which we are definitely not happy with the way Russia is behaving with its invasion of Ukraine. And we're in a complicated world, we're in a dangerous world, and we're in a world which is facing climate change. We're going to have to work with China on climate change. It is one of the major investors in industry, but it's also one of the major polluters. So we have to work with them. But we also need to be able to talk to them about human rights. So whether it's the Uyghur Muslims and the persecution that they're experiencing, we need to keep lines of communication open to do that. But I'm glad that David Lammy, who's our Shadow Foreign Secretary, has been doing a lot of work on how we make the 21st century ethical foreign policy and what that means in the mid-20s. We had Robin Cook, who first introduced the concept of an ethical foreign policy.
And I think then lived to regret it, didn't he?
Yes, but we've all got that legacy to learn from, and I think David's done an amazing job of actually trying to think about how you make best use of putting trade with ethical values at the heart of it, and how you make human rights part of it.
But it's not possible, is it? frankly.
It's not easy.
I mean, if you look at China, there are all sorts of things. I mean, you mentioned a few of them. I mean, the Uyghur Muslims. I mean, the Chinese government stands accused of committing a genocide there.
Yes.
So how you can then talk about an ethical foreign policy and still want to trade with China, I don't know.
Well,
It's realpolitik in the end that wins out, isn't
I was
it?
talking there about broad brush approach to foreign policy in general, but in relation to China in particular. If we don't talk to them about climate change, we will not be able to halt climate change. So that is one particular policy area where I think we cannot fail to talk to keep lines of communication open with China. But at the same time, we all have to have those. Yeah, they may be difficult conversations, but part of having an ethical foreign policy is about being able to say, we do not think that what you're doing, how you're treating the Uyghur Muslims, is acceptable. But in order to do that, you have to be able to keep in dialogue.
Just before I come to you, Kit, some breaking news. The SNP Treasurer Colin Beattie has been released by Scottish Police without charge. Kit Malthouse, is an ethical foreign policy even possible when we're talking about China?
Well, it depends what your framework of ethics is. I mean, I forget who it was. Was it Disraeli who said we have no constant friends and no constant enemies, only constant interests, right? And so we have to kind of duck and dive in, as Thangam says, a complicated world. I mean, the thing with China is they're massive. It's a third of humanity. They are, the fastest growing, biggest nation in the world, and we just can't ignore them. Right?
Actually, I think
the
India,
sheer size.
in terms of population, India is now.
I think India's coming up on China, but they sort of vie for first, but sort of economically it's the case. And we're probably all sitting here in clothes that are made in China and drinking out of mugs that are made in China. And, quite a lot of stuff now comes from China. So the idea that we could pull some kind of shutter down is crazy. They are an economic powerhouse. If China coughs, the world catches a cold, and we've seen that over the last few years. And so we have to play cards with them, and we have to communicate with them. But I think it's absolutely right that we also need to be wary and protect ourselves from the kind of their ability to hoover up, for example, our intellectual property, their ability to get into society in a way that is perhaps not completely desirable. And so I think constructive engagement is probably the best way forward, but with our eyes open. The other thing to bear in mind, of course, is that over the last few years, they have been spreading their sphere of influence across the world, all up the continent of Africa and elsewhere, and that has caused some concern. And, we've seen impact, I guess, on our wider ambit. I forget which island, was it Barbados or Bermuda, one of them that took a big loan from China and then decided they didn't want to have much to do with us anymore. And so there are alliances that are shifting and changing. There are some areas of alarm. If you talk to the Japanese, they're very concerned about what the Chinese are doing in the South China Sea, building artificial islands, then claiming a 200-mile territorial approach to it. And I think what we really need to do is try and work out, in the medium to long term, what do China want? What are they trying to achieve? And can our interests be aligned with what they want to achieve? And is that the same as what we want to achieve? And if so, then we should be constructive in our engagement.
Okay, Iain Dunt.
I think liberals, like myself, were a bit naive for too long with China, for decades really, that we thought that if we allow them into the economic system, into the trading system, they will become more open and more democratic by virtue of doing trade with us. And that is not what took place. China remained largely unchanged internally in terms of its political dynamics, but it succeeded in terms of trade. And so now we're faced with a situation where the closed societies, the authoritarian societies of the world, feel tremendously confident in themselves. You see it in Saudi Arabia, you see it in China, and we saw it with Putin. The reason that Putin is in Ukraine right now is because he decided that open societies no longer had the courage of their own convictions to stand up to closed societies. So we can't be unrealistic about it. There's no way that we're all going to give up having a PlayStation and a mobile phone and cheap clothes, and it's just not going to happen. So no government's going to pretend that that's going to be the case. But this process where we're building in confidence and opposition to countries like that and what they're doing is a very healthy one and a much needed one.
OK, let's move on. David, thank you for that question. I think it's one of the best questions we've had recently. Let's move on to Andrew in Reading, who sent in this by text. Extinction Rebellion are warning they'll bring London to a standstill this weekend off the back of that Just Stop Oil stunt at the snooker last night. Do these groups do anything to help their own cause with stuff like this? Now, 2 people have been released on bail after being arrested at the Crucible in Sheffield yesterday. When I was reading about this, Iain, I was thinking, if they try and disrupt the London Marathon, I mean, surely, I get sort of protests always want to generate publicity, and no doubt they would generate huge publicity. We would no doubt have phone-ins on it for the next couple of days, thereby playing into their hands. But it would surely damage their case if they did that.
They've been doing that the whole time, really. I mean, there's nothing you can do, for instance, to a Londoner to turn them off your cause more than get in the way of their commute. And that happened early on. I sort of have... Everyone has the right to protest. I really support them in their protest. I happen to agree with them on pretty much every part of their political programme. What I struggle with, just tactically, is when it looks like you're targeting the public rather than the politicians themselves or the government. And that point seems to me like a really rudimentary PR error that's been said. Now, I instinctively want to defend them. I absolutely despise the 2 pieces of legislation so far the government has passed, which has put completely unacceptable limits on protest on the basis of what they've been doing. But nevertheless, when they follow these tactics, I constantly look at it and just think, like, just not like this, lads, not like this.
Which is odd, isn't it? Because when they first came onto the scene, 5 or 6 years ago, even people like me thought they were kind of a breath of a fresh air in the way that they were protesting. Mm-hmm. But Sophia, that has changed over the years, hasn't it? They've changed tactics, and I wonder why that is.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I was doing a lot of research into sort of the rise of anti-establishment movements a long time, before Brexit and all these other sort of moments of very expressive politics, shall we say. And I think there were already quite a few people there who saw this coming. I think there was a feeling that environmental protesters would be the next sort of movement that would harness the power of social media as an organizing tool. And obviously, I think if anybody could predict that climate change was going to become an increasingly important area. But for some reason, institutionally, we didn't get that message. And I still am not quite sure that government fully has its head around the scale of this, because I don't personally see this kind of movement dulling in its potency at all moving forward. And I find it very concerning. I mean, I absolutely agree with Iain that they're just sort of rather hapless in their PR strategy, but also, I mean, even as in terms of organising principles, I mean, surely they're trying to influence policymakers here. What they're actually doing is just turning the public against them. And I think a lot of the British people absolutely agree. I mean, huge majorities of the British people agree that more needs to be done on climate change and fully support net zero transition and so on. I think they're sort of barking up the wrong tree. And I think they have to be rather careful, because what they will actually do inadvertently is create narratives that work against them and may end up actually giving rise to other kind of counter movements that I think could be very dangerous.
At Malthouse, in the very seat that you're sitting in, one of these protesters glued themselves to the desk. Mm-hmm. I don't imagine you're going to do that tonight, even though I know you'd love to stay here for the next 24 hours.
Longer than the hour, yeah.
But when you think about it, what did that protest achieve? It meant that they won't be invited into the studio ever again, so they don't get to put their point of view across in the way that they presumably would want to. The whole point of protesting is to win hearts and minds and influence policy. I would have thought, or am I being naive on that?
No, you're not being naive, and it's kind of lazy and self-indulgent. I mean, I have to tell you, I've been an MP since 2015. Not once has anybody from Just Stop Oil Extinction Rebellion approached me as an MP, asked to come and see me, talked about the issues, understand what my views are, recommend that I vote a particular way. Not once. They'd much rather... Maybe
you're a lost cause for them.
Well, it's crazy. This is the way our democracy works, right? And yet they're out there with this kind of self-indulgent stuff. The snooker last night was, extraordinary. What did they think was going to happen? And so my concern is, as I share with the others, is that they're just going to turn people off what is an incredibly important agenda, and they seem unwilling to do the kind of sometimes laborious and hard work that both Thangam and I have had to do, of knocking on doors, winning an election, getting our agenda and manifesto out there, swaying the public to vote for what we want and what we believe in. And, that's the way, in the end, you try and get change. And the problem is it's not entirely clear what they want or whether what they want is kind of realistic, right? We basically want you to stop using oil like sort of now, tomorrow, please, otherwise we'll keep doing what we're doing. And there's never any acceptance, for example, that we've eliminated coal pretty much from our power system, that of all the large developed nations, we've reduced our emissions faster than almost anybody else, right? That we lead the world in offshore wind. None of those things are ever kind of ticked up as okay, great. Right, now we need to do a bit more. And the trouble is extremism is never really that persuasive. And I think they regard themselves as sort of martyr-type extremists, and they're certainly not winning the hearts and minds of the public, not in my constituency.
Thangam, have they approached you at all?
No. And in fact,
I do find that incredible, don't you?
I mean, to be clear, I've been approached by people who care deeply about climate change, and that's not what I'm talking about.
Too.
But I have been very close in my office to a climate change, an Extinction Rebellion march, and I saw a sign literally walking past my office window that said, "Where's my MP?" And I thought, well, not a single one of you told me you were going to be marching past here, and not a single one of you has made an appointment to see me. Now, that's fine. That's their decision. That's up to them. But I think climate change is too important not to try and bring people with you. And the planet is too important not to try and bring people with you. And it just feels like the right aim, which is to halt climate change, but if you're using tactics that trade in fear and in making life unpleasant for the wrong people, gluing yourself to a train or putting powder on a snooker table, I don't think anybody's mind was changed last night. And I just think that's sad because it's too important. Now, we have got a green prosperity plan. We do know it's urgent. We know that we need to get to net zero as quickly as possible. It's going to be really difficult. We need everybody on board. And that actually can be a hopeful thing to do, because I don't want us to have to do it because of climate change, but actually I think it's great that we are all starting to see, if you have renewable energy, if you do focus on cleaning up the planet, you're actually going to make a better world and a better life for the next generation. And that's the hopeful vision that I want to inspire young people. When I go and visit children in schools almost every week, they always say to me, climate change is the most important thing. But far too often, some of them have listened to someone who said to them, nobody's doing anything, government's not doing anything, politicians don't do anything. And that's not helpful, because actually, we may disagree. I actually disagree vehemently with Kit on the speed with which his government is approaching this. I think they should be doing it much faster and much stronger. But it's not true that nobody's doing anything, and that's not right.
I know you want to come back, but we've got to go. No, we've got to go to the news, I'm afraid. We're already 3 minutes late, and Corey will have my guts for garters, as usual. It's 8:33 on LBC. Let's get the latest news headlines from Darryl Jackson.
SNP Treasurer Colin Beattie has been released without charge pending further investigation. It's after he was arrested in connection with an investigation into the party's finances earlier. Several people have been injured in a suspected stabbing at a gym in Western Germany. Police say it happened in the old city of Duisburg. And there's been a strong criticism of the energy regulator's new rules around prepayment meters after some were controversially installed by force. Ofgem's now ban them for people over the age of 85 or with severe health issues, but the guidelines are only voluntary. LBC weather: much of the UK will be largely clear tonight and turn chilly. The odd shower in the far southwest and a low of freezing.
This is LBC.
8:36 on LBC. Thangam Debbonaire is with us, Shadow Leader of the House of Commons. What does that actually involve? It sounds very grand, Shadow Leader. Do people call you
I'll
leader?
let you two into a little secret, but it is the best job in politics, in my view. Don't tell anybody or they'll all want to be it. I think, well, it's the second best because I actually want to be Leader of the House of Commons. And of course, if we go into government and Keir asks me to, I'll be absolutely thrilled to bits. Being Leader of the House of Commons means you are responsible. You are Parliament's representative in government. You're government's representative in Parliament. You're also responsible for coordinating the parliamentary timetable and 100 other things besides. But the sort of manner in which we get things done in Parliament is on the Leader of the House.
And do you need to be on good terms with the person who's the leader?
I always.
I imagine you and Penny Mordaunt might get on quite well. You both have well-developed senses of humour.
Well, every single Leader of the House that I've shadowed, I've had a different relationship with, but every single one of them, we've been able to work together constructively because we have to do quite a few things together. Unlike some of our other compadres, we actually do have to work together.
You are the living embodiment. You are the usual channels.
Yes,
aren't you?
We're actually the usual.
Have you ever
channels.
been called anything so nice?
Mm.
Sophia Gaston is with us, Head of Policy, Foreign Policy and UK Resilience for Policy Exchange, and Iain Dunt, political commentator, journalist and author. He's got this new book out called How Westminster Works and Why It Doesn't. Now, it kind of does what it says on the tin, but is the book, Iain, just a litany of saying, well, this is what's wrong with it, or do you actually come up with lots of solutions?
No, the final chapter is solutions. Yeah, and some of them are quite big and some of them are quite small.
Right.
So, like,
elevator pitch, 1 minute, go.
Well, let me give you just one solution, for instance, right? Like, ministers have a private office in their department. That's a set of civil servants who work for them, who inform them what's going on in the department or what's going on from Downing Street. Something that might help us would be for MPs to have a set private office for all of them, a cadre of civil servants who are there to inform them about legislation, what's in it. Don't wait for the MPs to ask. Tell them in advance. Where are the problems? What are the statutory instrument powers that are being proposed here that might just look a bit big, that look like the government's giving itself too many ideas? What are the bits that will and will not work? Because in our system, one of the problems that we have is the government has far too much power, and also, by the way, so does the official opposition. When it decides what it's doing, the leadership of the official opposition has way too much power as well. Individual MPs, particularly thoughtful, independent-minded MPs, have too many pressures on them, too little time and too few resources. And one of the ways we could improve legislation and not get the kind of slop that we've seen over the last few years, decades in fact, would be to actually help educate them about the legislation that's passing through Parliament.
Doesn't that mix the government and the legislature a bit too much?
It's fine. I mean, in the US, you have, bureaucrats work for the Congress. They don't necessarily work for the president. You can easily get away with having these structures in place. We have the House of Commons library that MPs can use now. It's just a bit too slow, and it's a little bit, it relies too much on MPs going to ask it for the information. We need to bolster MPs' powers to scrutinise government in any number of ways, and that would be one of them.
Okay.
Can I just say, I mean, I think it's a strong point. I did have a scan through Iain's book before I came here, and I thought it was really interesting and thoughtful, actually. But the as a backbench MP now, having been a minister before, and obviously I was a backbench MP for a brief period when I first got elected, I think it's absolutely right that you as an MP, you have to pick and choose the legislation that you're bothered about, because you just don't have the capacity to cover all the bases. We had a debate this afternoon on the Finance Act. I'm particularly interested in it. There were only, I think, 3 or 4 speakers on our side who were focused on what is this huge piece of legislation that will have a massive impact on everybody's life. And there were some detailed technical questions, because some of us had happened to do the research. And I'm a boring chartered accountant, so it's of interest to me. But there's quite a lot of MPs that don't do that. And I would love, for example, to have a legislative assistant as a backbencher who was able, as you say, or maybe 2 or 3, given the volume of stuff that's come through, to do exactly that. Point me in the right direction and give me an idea what it is. But the number of times you go into the lobby and people walk into the lobby and say, what are we voting on?
Yeah, I know. And you asked me what the Shadow Leader of the House does, and one of the reasons my little eyes lit up then when I was listening to Iain talk about his book is that's what most of my day has been about, actually, is thinking about talking to other people and put Iain on my list to talk to, of who've got great ideas about how we could do legislating better. Parliament has really key functions, and the public, and we know this from some of the recent research that's been done by the Constitution Unit, they really want us to be able to scrutinise the executive, whichever party it is, whether it's our own or another. They want us to be able to get stuck into representing them on specific causes that matter to them. And there are so many things that I think we could do so much better to equip our MPs for that core work.
But the problem is, if you do what Ian suggests and give MPs many more resources, say each MP gets a legislative assistant and maybe one or two other members of staff, then the general public see these figures. Oh, they were getting £200,000 expenses. Now they're getting 350.
It's not expenses, Ian. It's called staffing.
Well, I know it is. I know it
yes,
is.
I know you
and
know.
I
But
try
I
and
want to make sure
explain that
everyone
to my
hears
listeners,
that.
but I might as well be talking.
Yeah, but I think that's a bit of a myth. To be honest with you, I think the vast majority of the public actually recognise that you need staff to deal with all the correspondence.
So.
I mean, most of mine are dealing with correspondence and with casework, so you haven't got the capacity in the budget to do that kind of stuff. The other thing I just wanted to raise, actually, that I mean, maybe Ian wouldn't agree, but I think is one of the key themes of his book is our model of government. Right, we're talking about the legislature at the moment, but the model of government of effectively, Thangam and I are kind of random individuals who got elected, and yet we could. I mean, I hope Thangam doesn't, but I did get put in a position of some authority and executive capacity in government without necessarily having any experience in that area. Now, I happen to have a career in local government and then city government and then national government, so feel a bit more experienced than perhaps others. And there's a question, an interesting question I think posed in the book about what is the model? If you look at other countries, they run an administration model where the leader picks a series of experts in each area who then run the department, who are then scrutinised and held to account by a legislature.
But I remember
but we don't run that model, and it's a bit confused, I think.
Back in 2010, I did an interview with Jackie Smith after she resigned as Home Secretary. And in that interview, she said, basically, ministers go into a job with no experience, they get no training at all. I was made Home Secretary. I mean, I thought I'd be able to do the job well, and I had a terror attack to deal with on day 2, but nobody prepared me for any of that. And so she was recommending there ought to be some sort of training. And of course, the newspapers wrote that up as Jackie Smith said she was clueless.
I know, and it's so unfair. And also, it's one of the things that organisations like the Institute for Government have taken by the scruff of the neck and said, well, OK, let's create some training. And I know that ministers on Kit's side and also former ministers on our side have actually availed of that or contributed to it. Well, I think we could do a lot more of that.
Well, one of the big areas that we need more education for parliamentarians is national security. And I mean, if we're pursuing a whole of society approach to resilience and national security, it's actually extraordinary how little information parliamentarians are given about some of the biggest projects. I mean, think about something like AUKUS. This is going to be one of the biggest era-defining projects of our time. Parliamentarians haven't been briefed in any significant way about that.
This is why you need to be an MP.
Well, then who's going to be running my role?
I mean, I'm not sure, Ian, because I think, the beauty of democracy is that people of all backgrounds, in theory, I mean, we could get into why some can't, can end up being MPs. But we have to take it as our responsibility to seek advice, to get that information. We have civil servants if we're in government. I mean, I love Ian's idea of we should have legislative affairs, but I think we could also do that in lots of different ways. And I think that's only one of the suggestions in your book, I'm sure. But I don't think we need to come to Parliament being experts on everything. That is impossible. But I do think we have to be willing to accept that we need to ask for advice and help about lots of things.
You can have a culture that values expertise. Though.
Exactly.
And we do not.
Totally. And I'm with you.
It doesn't really come up in reshuffles. You think about who's a loyalist for me, getting rid of the others and balancing a party. And even if someone by accident does develop expertise in their cabinet position, which they usually do after 18 months or so, they're just shuffled off to something else. So we end up with this kind of professionalised amateurism at almost every stage of the political system, and that has been to our considerable detriment.
Well, I did say elevator pitch in 1 minute. We've actually spent for the first time on the programme, a whole quarter of the programme talking about someone's book. So well done.
I barely said anything.
Because we're all fascinated.
It was obviously very interesting. We're going to come back to your calls, believe it or not, in just a moment. It's 8:45.
LBC
Thangam, Debbonaire, Kit Malthouse, Iain Dunt and Sophia Gaston with us answering your questions. Right, let's go to another text question from Genevieve in Hackney. The government says police are solving the problem of stop and search unfairly targeting black people. Is it a good way of getting weapons and dangerous people off the streets, or just something which causes resentment? We're going to be talking about this much more after 9 o'clock. The Equalities Minister, Kemi Badenoch, says stop and search is a vital tool for police and has produced figures which show the racial disparity in its use almost halved in the 2 years to March 2022, which on the face of it sounds quite good until you actually look at the figures. If you are black, you were 8.9 times more likely to be stopped for stop and search than if you're white. The figures come down to 4.9. So, I mean, sort of halved, but it's still 4 point now. Now, Kit Malthouse, let's start with you, because you were Deputy Mayor for Policing under Boris Johnson.
I was.
And this was a really a key subject for discussion. I remember doing lots of phone-ins on it during that time.
Yeah, it was massive. And, you know, we got elected in 2008 in the face of a huge rise in knife crime and young people being stabbed and killed on London streets. In the first year, 2008, we had 29 young people killed. I'd say overwhelmingly from the black community. And we instituted a huge and assertive programme of stop and search, recognising that we were on a rising trend that could have seen 50, 60, 70. We were told in the early days that we shouldn't be bothered because it was an insignificant number. These were just percentages, but these were people's kids that were being killed. And so it was difficult.
Who was telling you that?
Sir Ian Blair said that. He in the early days, he said, look, this isn't, percentage-wise, this is not massive. So we were very concerned about it, and while it was very difficult and it caused enormous problems, we did, I have to say, Boris and I both work hard to sell it into the communities who were both were so significantly affected. By the time we got to 2012, we got the number down to 8, still 8 too many, but an incredibly low number. And during that period, we'd taken thousands and thousands of knives off the street, and we'd crucially raised the perception of the likelihood of getting caught. Now, it wasn't all straight individual stop and search. We did lots of, knife arches at transport hubs, putting everybody through, raising this idea that if you carry a knife, you're much more likely to get caught, and so you shouldn't do it in the first place. And we saw numbers fall and stay down. And sadly, over the last few years, it's risen again, particularly in London, but elsewhere in the country too.
But Theresa May was the Home Secretary that urged a change to stop and search, because, you look at the figures, there can't be any justification for a black person being 8 or 9 times more likely to be stopped than a white person, surely.
You say that, Ian, but I've been challenged many times over the years on stop and search, and I'm challenged on the racial disparity of stop and search, but nobody ever challenges me on the racial disparity of victims. Right, particularly in London, and overwhelmingly, sadly, those victims, and more often than not the perpetrators of teenage stabbings, come from minority communities. Now, that is a major problem, right, and we should be bothered about that. And if that means we have to do difficult things, then we should. Now, stop and search should always be refined. You can always do it better. It has to be done more respectfully as you possibly can. Body-worn video has made a huge difference to stop and search, because it immediately diffuses the situation. Both copper and person being searched know they're on video. And so what could otherwise have been a confrontational situation is avoided. But, when you've got 20, 30 kids being stabbed annually, or getting on for nearly 1 a week. In the July of 2008, right, we had 6 kids stabbed in a week, 3 in 1 day. Now, that is an emergency, right? And the knives are out there that night. And the only tool available to us in the short term is stop and search, and so you have to use it.
But it's
now, that's no substitute, Ian, for the long-term work you need to do with young people to turn them away from those kind of decisions. But in an emergency situation, it's absolutely vital.
But it goes back to our last discussion, in a sense, because you said, effectively, you told the Metropolitan Police Commissioner he was wrong, and you and Boris Johnson, as politicians, had to push this through against the resistance of the police, who most people would assume that they knew what they were doing.
To be fair, there's a guy called Tim Godwin who ran what was then called territorial policing. He then became temporary commissioner when Ian Blair when Paul Stevenson went, they were moving around quite a lot of the time. And he picked it up with alacrity, and he came up with this Operation Blunt 2, which was about a more sophisticated use of stop and search, as I say, much more signalling. We worked out, for example, that in Croydon town centre there was something like 30 to 40,000 kids transiting through every day, twice a day, going to and from school. And therefore, if we did big knife arch operations there that everybody went through, irrespective of what they looked like or who they were, it would send a big signal about the fact that the police are out there looking for knives. And all I can say is over the 4 years it worked, and indeed then beyond.
Thangam, you represent a constituency in Bristol which has also had its fair share of issues in this area. What is stop and search routinely used by Bristol Police?
Over the last 7 years, I've had many meetings with the former Chief Constable, Andy Marsh, and the former Police and Crime Commissioner, and of course the current ones. And they've talked to me a lot about the problems of knives and dangerous weapons on our streets. In fact, they've brought some to show me. And at no point have they said, we want you to give us more power to do stop and search. In fact, they've never argued, that, to my memory, that was the answer. Now, what they have said is that they felt that they had lost valuable resources in the early part of this decade when police numbers were reduced. They felt they'd lost the trust of the community when there were stories about stop and search. That actually damages trust in the very community that we're often trying to protect, as Kit acknowledges, but also trying to work with. And policing in this country is by consent, and that needs trust, it needs respect, and it needs us to be able to move away from racial profiling, which targets people on the basis of skin colour rather than the basis of other risk factors. And we need to move towards making sure we've got good community policing. We need to restore those numbers, and the Labour government would do that, and I would like to see the current Tory government do that. They could if they wanted to, but a Labour government will. And I'd also like to see that long-term work, because, we do have to do the short-term and the long-term. Mm. And in the long-term, we are going to need to make sure that we understand what's going on the streets of our cities, in my neighbourhood, in the part of town, the city of Bristol that I represent, where we have had some absolutely horrific crimes. And that's mothers losing their children, that's families losing a son. It's just not acceptable. And for me, the idea that you then racially profile and target people on the basis of their race rather than on other risk factors, and I know Kit's now going to tell me it's more complicated than that, and you also said that there was more to it than that, and I respect that, because there was more to it than that.
The thing about
racial profiling destroys trust, and it removes the hope of working together.
Sorry, just to be clear, it's not about racial profiling, absolutely not.
But that's how people experience it.
But the one thing we do know about violence is that it's very geographically sticky. There are areas that tend to attract more violence than other areas.
Policing.
And it's about the demographic in that area that isn't naturally affected. So you don't get a huge amount of stop and search in Kensington, in London, but you might, in
you can do geographically targeted hotspot work.
So that geography has an impact on what your numbers look like. And the recognising that violence is sticky and geographic is key.
The problem isn't with the actual act itself, it's with the fact that our police forces, and especially the Metropolitan Police, are completely corroded by their inability to grapple sensibly with issues around sex and race. It's been a really long time in this city that I've spoken to a black or a brown friend who will tell me that they trust the police, and it's been a really long time since I've spoken to a woman in this city who said that she would report a crime against her to the police. Now, if that's the situation that you have, when you have these kinds of extremely intrusive powers, they are invariably going to get caught up in that kind of lack of trust and that kind of police misbehaviour. But the problem there is with the police force, not with the technique itself.
Sophia?
I witnessed a terrible act of violence just a couple of weeks ago in London on my way home at night, and it was teenagers, committing this. And I unfortunately, it's not the first time this has happened recently. It's a really difficult one because I understand why everyone feels that we need to invest in the nuts and bolts here. People are afraid, and there is institutional reform that needs to take place. I think at the same time, we do also need to be looking at some of the softer skills that police are developing, to the point about the police commanding the consent of the community, investing in communications, de-escalation, other sorts of strategic approaches that can take the heat out of some of these situations. But at the end of the day, it really does start to feel in London that people do not feel that they are going to be held accountable for crimes. And if that's the situation, then I find it difficult for us to not be looking at some pretty drastic action.
Right, let's move on to our final text question. It's from Tanya in Lincoln. The boss of Apple was presented with an original Macintosh computer from 1987 by a fan in India today. Which vintage gadget would you be thrilled, as he was, to be given to you now? Now, Tim Cook, the boss of Apple, was in Mumbai today to open a new Apple store. Iain Dunt.
I think I want my first Nokia mobile phone back so I can get back my time.
Such a great phone.
and I want to play Snake again. Yeah, Snake. It was like the greatest mobile game of all time. And we didn't know because it was the first one.
Mobile equivalent to doctors and nurses or something.
and the battery lasted forever.
Clean your mind.
Yeah, that's true.
Sophia.
I'm thinking in a similar vein. I had some appallingly bad original phone cameras. You know, when the camera first came on the phone, and everything looked like a sort of tiny vintage Polaroid, but not in a good way. It was sort of blurry. I sometimes do think when my friends have even better, newer cameras, phones than me, I actually think, I don't know that I want to be in 4D, 4K, or whatever we are now. I wouldn't mind a little bit of a restricted camera functionality.
Thangam.
I can think of so many. I'm going to go for my first Sony Walkman, or possibly my first ever camera, which is definitely not digital. But I'd also give anything for a gadget that does not exist anymore, in my view. It's a charger that doesn't just stop working randomly when you've only had it for a few months. I'd like gadgets that last. So my Sony Walkman lasted. I've still got it.
Teenagers at home saying, Mum, what's a Sony Walkman?
Oh.
Pit.
Well, I'm going to give my age away now. And I can remember when my dad, who's also an accountant, came home with the first Sinclair pocket calculator.
Oh, yes.
And I've still got one, the one that he gave me in my top drawer. But given that Clive Sinclair, I think, died last year, didn't he, or the year before, was such a pioneer, I'd like a Sinclair C5.
Oh, really?
Do you remember them?
Yeah.
Talk about, that would be fun. You love electric cars, Ian. Sinclair C5 would be right up your street.
No, I want my BlackBerry back. That's what I want.
Oh, BlackBerry.
Best phone ever.
Oh.
And once they tried to replicate the iPhone, they just went completely wrong. Anyway, thank you all very much for joining us for this evening's Cross Question. We have another one for you tomorrow. Coming up in the next hour, we're going to return to the subject of the police uses of stop and search. Kemi Badenoch, the Equalities Minister, says it's essential, despite them overly affecting ethnic minorities. She said the tactic was a vital tool in tackling violence and said progress has been made on reducing the racial disparity. That is true. But do you think the use of stop and search should be expanded or retrenched? 0345 6060 973. That's the number to call here on LBC.